All right, let's do this. So friends, this is a pretty special day because this represents the last PD session in the series. So we've been together for months at this point. I know some of you have been, I recognize a lot of you from multiple sessions, so I appreciate that. And our hope is that this has helped to kind of frame some trauma-informed practices that can help you across all tiers. We want to send a special shout out to our friends at the Center on Child Wellbeing and Trauma for funding this. And also just want to kind of throw out there that love my team at Thriving Minds. We've got Courtney Tucker here. We got Amanda Chung here. Love them dearly. We're moving together toward a better end with education and with trauma responsiveness and with school mental health and all the things. So very happy to be here with them today. Courtney's going to take a huge piece of this last presentation. You were in very, very good hands. So I'm just going to kind of call out the fact that, ultimately, we're here as a function of Center on Child Wellbeing and Trauma as Thriving Minds. And yeah, Courtney from Bright, Amanda from Rennie, and I'm from MASMHC, and we care about you and want you to be trauma informed. So Courtney, I'm here for you. You tell me what you need me to do, but ball's in your court, my friend.
All right. So most of you all, some may know me. I show up, I appear, and then I disappear. And so just glad to be with you all. I'll be leading some of the session. And what a greater time to actually begin to think about, why are we even here, right? What are the purpose? Why are we here? Why did you all commit to showing up? And then to talk a little bit more about the how. You've heard John talk about it. I'm going to go into a little more about it, just refreshing it, our trauma informed and healing centered. And then I'm going to talk about how do we craft our what? We know our why, we know our how, and now what are we doing, right? And so you've heard John go through and talk about MTSS, but you'll hear me talk about, and I would say, if we're trauma informed and we're healing centered, we have to be talking about adults. So we're going to talk a little bit about that adult care piece in there, and then we're going to have a wrap up and questions. And so to get us started, the first slide, you might be like, well, where did Courtney get this framework of the why, the how, and the what? So as you can see, I got it from a book called The Golden Circle. And in The Golden Circle, there's a guy who says, you know what, I'm an absolute optimist, unshakable. I don't care what happens in the world. I believe something good can happen, right? But the reason he's like, I can do that is because I'm constantly shifting and focusing and thinking about my why, right? And they said, look, your why, that's like why you show up. Why do you do the work? Why do you keep leaning in? You all, I think, are doing one of the hardest jobs leading schools and students and adults and families right now when they don't want to be led anywhere. And so how do you hold on to your why that keeps you going, right? And so Snick reminds us that, look, if you can know your why, then you can keep going. He says it's the reason that you exist. It's the reason. I think people have gotten away from, we don't even know why schools are started anymore, right? Like if we could get back to and agree on the why, I think we might have a different outcome, right? And so you'll see that Snick says in the next slide, he's like, look, the best leaders and the most inspiring people, the people that we read about, that we look up to, that we'll quote over and over again, those people, all you can tell us their why, whether it's to bring freedom, whether it's to bring recognition, whether it's to bring liberation, whether it's to bring resources, whether it's even to change how we act. Steve Jobs like, look, I got y'all addicted. You can't see it because I got a screenshot. He got us addicted to these little things that we hold, our phones, right? And what they do is when you attach your why, when you are moving from your why, they say you find energy and you excite other people around you, right? And the quote that he used, he says, if you talk about what you believe, you'll attract people who believe what you believe. So you bring excitement, you bring energy to it. And so what we're gonna do is I'm gonna place you all in groups, and Amanda's gonna do that for me. You're gonna be in groups for about 5 minutes. Because one thing is I want you all to think about why. And I want you to share with your group two whys. I want to know, why are you here? So why you show up today? What's your why? What's your why? And I also want to know, what's your why for doing the work that you do? And I want you to write it down, but we're going to place you in groups, and we just want you to talk about why why do you show up at your job every day? Why, and don't say money, because it has to be more than that. Because y'all got a hard job. There's other ways you can make money. You know, people out here reinventing themselves. Why do you show up every day? All right. So Amanda has placed you all in groups. Amanda, you can open up those groups. You'll be in it for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll further our discussion. Having the opportunity to actually share about your why. So I want you to hold on to your why, because I want to remind us there's this thing, and on the next slide, you'll see there's a chart, and in it, it actually says, you know what? Did you all realize that, oh, some 20, 30 years ago, there's something that said, look, we're going to do a Maslow hierarchy of needs of schools, right? And it says, look, at the core, at the basic level, schools need to provide psychological safety. It needs to be psychological, like making sure basic needs are met. Then it needs to move up to safety, emotional and physical. And then it says it should value relationships. So this is what has to happen. And then it says, look, and then we need to think about positive classroom culture and feedback. And then we get to the actual self-actualization, which is learning. I would love for you all to think about this. Do you all think we actually utilize this hierarchy of needs when we're thinking about our school day and setting up schools? Have we refreshed it? Do we talk about it? You know, one of the things, and so part of the reasons, the why, in which John and Randy Center and Thriving Minds, and we've all embarked on this journey with you all, is we want to get back to recognizing, like, look, we have to be attuned to this hierarchy of school needs, particularly thinking about the psychological, the safety, the belonging, and the esteem. All of that gets us into when we think about what's our how, right? And when we look at the next slide and we think about our how, the how we're thinking about is like, and holding on to is like, look, everyone is affected by trauma in some sort of way, right? And it's saying, how do we move from being trauma affected to healing centered? And that's the journey that we've been on for these past 6 sections. It's actually equipping everyone and actually getting you techniques, getting you language so that you can actually be the eyes and ears, and actually, I say, thought leaders in moving your particular school, your district, or your organization toward being healing centered and trauma informed, right? So it's really making sure that we understand, you know what does it mean? So John has said, you had a bunch of sessions, and it says, what does it mean to really say we're trauma informed, right? And so SAMHSA defines it in this way. If we look at the next slide, SAMHSA says, look, trauma informed means, one, I recognize and realize that the impact of trauma is it's widespread, right? And as much as I recognize and understand that trauma is widespread, understand that that means that there is an unlimited pathways to healing, right? The other piece SAMHSA says is it recognizes that trauma isn't just about the student or the client, it's about everyone that's involved in the system. And so if we're gonna embrace a trauma-informed approach, we really recognize that it's about the entire system. The other piece we recognize is that, look, we have to respond to it, and we don't just have to respond to it by in a personal level, but we acknowledge that we got to respond to it and our policies and procedures. And the last R for SAMHSA is like, look, we got to resist re-traumatization, right? It said, look, that's what it means to set up trauma-informed agencies, to be attuned to the 4 Rs, which are realize, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. When we do that, on the next slide, you'll see is we're actually taking our organizations and shifting them from being trauma-inducing to actually trauma-reducing. And when we say something is trauma-reducing, we're actually saying it's healing center. It's shifting the questions that we're asked. We're getting to a place. I tell you, one of the hardest things right now, if we think about the environments we're in, when someone has a trauma response, they become very rigid, right? Very fear-driven, very overwhelmed. That we haven't recognized that the systems that we're in are actually having trauma responses to what's happening over the past couple of years. When a system is having a trauma response, you notice rigidity. You'll also notice when a system is having a trauma response, it becomes, I want you to do, it becomes very directive. It's no longer collaborative. It becomes very heavy-handed. It doesn't feel good, right? And the system has to recognize it's having a trauma response, right? What normally what happens is if the system is having a trauma response, guess what it does to the people in it? It provokes a trauma response from the people in it. So what happens to the people? They become rigid. Don't talk to me. It's rigid. It's no longer a collaborative relationship. The other thing you begin to see is things that we have moved away from, where we're saying, we're going to offer an opportunity. We're going to offer multiple different opportunities to do things. It ends up being, things become really small. People are like, no, you're going to do this. That's all. You don't get options. We're not going to moderate. You're just going to do what I asked of you. But how many of us begin to recognize that is because we haven't responded. We haven't healed. We haven't embraced the response that our systems are in a trauma response place. They're being very trauma reactive. And so one of the things that John has talked about is like, let's shift. You know what? Let's do these 4 Rs. Let's shift to being trauma informed, but not just trauma informed, because if we stop there, we're still saying what happened to you, but we actually become trauma reducing when we begin to think about how can I help you, right? And we shift from being rigid to being collaborative. We shift from just wanting one way of doing things to saying we can be flexible and we can be adaptive. We can be, inclusive. We're not just saying I'm only thinking about how I can respond to what's in front of me, but I'm also thinking about, okay, how do I step for a minute and zoom back and integrate feedback, right? One of the hard things to do when you're doing embracing a trauma-informed way of being is you actually have to set aside time. And you've heard John say this over and over again, is you got to have feedback loops. You actually have to set aside time to be reflective and be able to ask yourself, you know what, is this working? Who is it working for? Who is being left out of the conversation? So healing center really means I'm going to commit to constantly being reflective. You can't be trauma informed if you aren't reflective. So if you're not making space in your day and places to be reflective, it's really hard. On the next slide, you're going to see there's actually a book that's come out that says, look, we're going to take trauma informed and we're going to push it a little bit further. We're actually going to think about trauma reformed and put equity at the center of it, right? And so what it says is, if we just look at trauma informed, then he says, look, we're only looking at it as an individual issue and not a collective issue. And I gave you some of the quote, but I want to read the entire quote from the book for you, because this really impacted my understanding of, oh, this is what it means to put equity at the center of saying that we're trauma informed. He says, in expanding our definitions of trauma, we must make sure we see trauma as a structural issue, not just an individual one. Scholars now recognize what people from marginalized communities have always known: oppression, bias, and discrimination cause trauma. Racism causes trauma. Islamophobia causes trauma. Heterosexism causes trauma. Transphobia causes trauma. And I'm not just talking about visible incidences of hate crimes. Oppression causes trauma through the ways it's built into everyday structures of school and society, and how these structures have persisted throughout generations. Trauma doesn't just happen at home. Trauma can happen by conditions and events in schools, and schools can cause trauma. So we have to acknowledge that schools can cause trauma. So if we take a structural approach, what it's really doing is it's shifting us, and you'll see on the next slide, it's shifting us into the realm of what we don't just look at adverse childhood experiences. We begin to look at all four realms of the ACEs, right? The first one is what you all have known and you've probably heard over and over again. It's the adverse childhood experiences, which is it impacts the individual and interpersonal context. You know, it's what we test for. But then at the bottom of the root, you begin to say, oh, our other ACEs, adverse community experiences, right? And when we say we have those adverse community experiences, now we're beginning to talk about poverty, lack of affordable housing, you know, food insecurity, unemployment, deteriorating environments, things out of people's control, right? And so we have our adverse community experiences. The next realm of ACEs, if we look at the next side, is actually, you know what? Now we need to acknowledge that they're adverse climate experiences, right? And those are things that are unestimated. We include COVID-19. You know, they impact community conditions, right? These are the things that impact community conditions: pollution, earthquake, floods, droughts, wildfires. Those things impact the community conditions, which is why you see them as the clouds above the adverse childhood experiences. And then you see the roots, which is the adverse community experiences. But then there's something beneath the surface. And that's that fourth realm of ACEs, which is the atrocious cultural experiences, right? And those are slavery, genocide, colonization, removal of property, right? Forced family socialization, right? And it's just a low sense. I tell anyone, you just have a low sense of political and social efficacy and mistrust, right? And that's grounded, and that's what grows. And those atrocious cultural experiences are the things that created the adverse community experiences. It's what our adverse childhood experiences grow out of, right? So it's an acknowledgement that there's not just one realm that's individually focused, right? But there's multiple different realms that affect and allow us when we think about equity-centered approaches. And so the next thing you will see is when we think about principles. So included in the book is this idea of what are principles of equity-centered trauma-informed education, right? What are they? And they're like, look, principle number one, right, is look, anti-racist, anti-oppression. We have to understand trauma-informed education is against all forms, all forms. And it has to begin to look at it, and we have to think about the causes of it. We have to ask ourselves, we have to reflect on it. It has to be included in our conversation. The other thing that it says is like, look, we have to acknowledge that it's asset-based. Trauma-informed that's equity-centered is assets-based. And what it means is that, look, we don't just believe in the pathology of trauma. Yes, somebody has experienced something hard, but we also believe in the possibility of well-being. And so it's an acknowledgement and a centering that says, look, you have an inherent capacity to survive, thrive, and heal. And your trauma is a normal response to what you've experienced. And we're going to do everything we can to try to fix the causes of it. But what I can really help you do is see that you have tools, you have things that you can value. They're going to help you get through this. That's going to build your resilience. So it's not just seeing someone as I've experienced trauma, it's saying, I also see the resources that you've used to get through it, right? Because there can be a tendency to say, we're going to treat the symptoms versus dealing with the root causes of well-being, right? If we just stay trauma and we don't bring that equity piece and make it assets-based, We don't think that there are roots that can be strengthened. The other thing is it becomes very system oriented. Trauma informed education is a full ecosystem. It's just not just a list of strategies that we apply, right? So it's not just a list of strategies that I'm going to give people, but it actually, when we say we're going to be trauma informed, we're actually saying, I'm going to think about the removal of toxic systems. I'm going to think about how am I actually bringing in culture into the classroom and making sure that it's connected and that it's valued at all different levels. And so that's the third principle of equity-centered trauma-informed care. The fourth one is like, again, that idea I can't say over and over again, it's just human-centered, right? It means we're centering this idea of humility and shared humility. That, you know what? I'm walking alongside someone because they've experienced something that they haven't been able to deal with. And I'm going to give them grace. I'm going to help them get hope. And I'm going to also extend a lot of patience. That's what it means to be human centered. And it also means to be culturally centered. The other thing, the fifth principle, is it really talks about, you know what, a trauma-informed education is a universal approach. Look, it acknowledges, we have to say, when we say a universal approach, adulthood isn't trauma-free. So as much as we want to have a trauma-informed approach, we have to acknowledge that adulthood isn't trauma-free. So if we're going to be trauma-informed, we have to think about the adults too. Adults are experiencing trauma too. And so a trauma-informed approach actually thinks about, how am I ushering healing and thinking about care for adults? And the last principle is just making sure that it's social justice focused, that we have to also zoom out and think about, you know what are we doing to actually think about a trauma-free world instead of normalizing that trauma happens to everyone, right? And what strategies are we beginning to implement for that? So that's a little bit about what it means to shift from just being trauma-informed to being equity-centered and trauma-informed. The next thing we're going to talk about is how does this shift to healing centered? Healing centered is trauma informed, right? And Dr. Sean Jenwright, who coined the phrase healing centered and talked about healing centered engagement, he shares this story and he says, look, I was actually sitting with a group of students. He says a group of Black males, and they were telling me everything that keeps them from getting where they want to go in life. And they were giving me their stories. And I'm sitting there and they're talking to me and we're doing everything and it feels real trauma informed. And he said, in a moment, I had a student looking at me and that student said, look, we're just focusing on what's happened to me. I'm not just my trauma. I'm more than that. He says, I'm not just my trauma. I'm more than that. And so when we begin to take a healing centered approach, we're beginning to tell people and encourage them and say, look, I see you, I hear you, I feel you. You are more than what happened to you. You know what? You are resilient, you are bright, you can be a part of your own healing. I'm not just gonna think about your symptoms, right? I'm going to actually focus on trying to tell you, you know what, how can you be a healthy and well human being? I'm going to acknowledge that you have dreams, that you have hopes, and you have ideas, right? And one of the things about embracing a healing centered approach, Dr. Genwright says, look, it believes in that I believe that I can restore your identity. It believes that you can have an identity outside of your trauma, and I can help you get there. That's what healing centered is. It's believing that you have an identity, you are more than your trauma, and that we're going to embrace how we can help you get there. I'm no longer just going to focus on what happened to you. I'm going to focus on how I can help you. I'm going to focus on how the community can support you. And I'm going to focus on helping you see yourself as more than what happened to you. So that's what healing centered is. So what we're gonna do is I want you to think about, John's giving you tools, you've heard past presentations, we've talked a lot about them. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take a moment And what I want you all to do in groups is I want you to, I always say, if you don't have a vision, you don't know where you're going. So we're gonna pause for a moment, and I actually want you all to explore, and I'm gonna place a Jamboard in the chat in a minute. I want you all to write down, how would you know you were in a trauma-informed and healing center environment? What would it feel like? What would it look like? What would people be saying and talking about? Let's make this tangible about what it means to be trauma-informed and healing centered. Again, the questions are, how would the environment feel? What would it look like? And what would people hear? So Amanda's gonna place you in groups. I'm gonna add the Jamboard to the chat. And when I do that, I want you all, hold on, to make sure in the groups, because we wanna capture this information, right? And we wanna capture it. Hold on, I think I can put this in the chat. Here we go. Here's the Jamboard. We wanna capture it. So you're gonna be in your groups for about 10 minutes. And I'll add the questions also to the chat again. John's doing it for me, and John, I love you for that. So Amanda, if you could open up those rooms, that would be great. Um, all righty. And here we go. So I just want to remind you all of something a quote that one of my colleagues, Sarah Rickney, wrote. As we think about healing, none of you all said that a trauma-informed environment was you all, or healing-centered environment, was you all fixing or resolving the trauma. Nobody said that. So, I mean, I think that holds on to that. It acknowledges, like, look, we're not going to fix it or resolve it. We're not that powerful, but we can help heal. You all talked about facilitating growth, and we can remind people of their work. They're not the problem. It's not their fault, right? They're mitigating some aspects of it. So you all just talked about that and lived into that. I just want to remind you all, when we think about the path to healing, and I laugh because this level of functioning, right? Our executive functioning, if we think about it, it really depends on where we fall on the spectrum. Our function, we can start off high at level of functioning, but if we've experienced a lot of social trauma, that drops really early, right? And so recognizing that it takes time, and the graph is going to look different for each of us. It takes time to get out of survival, out of into recovery, and then actually into thriving, right? And they're like, look, you're going to experience challenges along the way. It's going to be really hard to do, but we can get there, right? It's just a matter of time. How many of you know, I say this, I said, we as in the US, we are really good at acute compassion and horrible at long-term empathy. Meaning, right when something happens, we're all in. We're sympathetic. We're gonna help the teachers. We're gonna show up. We're gonna be there. But if it impacts me, if it has a lasting impact on me, how many people no longer are thinking, "Oh, schools and teachers are still experiencing the effects of COVID"? Y'all are. We don't even know what those impacts are gonna be. We don't know how long they're gonna be. Right? But in order to hold that perspective and not think, oh, it's over, means I have to hold long-term empathy for what someone is experiencing. To get to healing, you have to have long-term empathy. And I just want to show you all, I'm going to walk you all through some quotes and images, because we talked a lot about, look, trauma-informed healing center starts with the adult. It doesn't start with the kid. You all just said it starts with adult and teacher care. And so that is because if the adult isn't in a place to be in a relationship, as Bruce Perry says, look, relationships can consume consume, they can terrorize, they can traumatize, and they can heal. But if an individual isn't ready to be in a healthy relationship, it's going to tear down any aspect. It's going to take the culture away. You're not going to be able to be healing centered and trauma informed if I'm not ready to be in a healthy relationship, not just with someone outside of me, but am I in a healthy relationship with myself? And so even thinking about individuals, when we think about adult care, how are we encouraging healthy relationships within self and outside of self? And so these are some quotes that reminded me of adult care and some thoughts and some images. Number one, it says, a community cannot thrive from drained individuals. If our adults, you all just said it in your thing, if the adults are drained, we're not going to get to a thriving community. I don't care how many expectations you throw at it. If people are drained, the community isn't going to thrive. The next one that was so eloquently said by Erin, she says, a dysregulated adult will struggle to regulate a dysregulated kid. Co-regulation is a thing. How many of y'all believe co-regulation is a thing? And actually, it's not that kids regulate to the adult. And so if an adult is escalated, a kid's gonna go there and become escalated also. Co-regulation is a thing. The other thing is it says, look, I want people to realize no single person can take care of all their needs. So we can't tell people, okay, you're overwhelmed, go take care of yourself. We actually have to think about how are we going to engage in helping individuals self-soothe. We got to have individuals caring for themselves. We got to have community care, and we got to have structural system level care. It can't just be go take care of yourself. And I think if you told somebody go take care of yourself, you might get a choice word thrown back at you if you said that in a school. Guarantee it. Somebody's gonna give it to you. Even if they project it to you, you'll get it, right? The other thing is when we think about this, and people, it's a lot of pressure, but it can reach a point where the tension and the pressure leads to exhaustion, and it leads to burnout, and it leads to breakdown. And so how are we recognizing, not just on an individual level, but how are we recognizing on the system level when we need to pull back and not apply as much pressure, and maybe not ask as much of people, because the tension has gotten to the point that people are in ill health, there's anxiety every day, and they're burnt out. And even asking ourselves, how do we recognize when the tension is too much? And are we willing to let go of who we are so that we can correct the tension? And so anyway, people don't change because they're afraid of the change. The change happens. What people are afraid of is the pieces of themselves that they have to let go of because of the change. How many of our systems are afraid of what they have to let go of in order to change so that people aren't burned out? Be willing to take the risk, let go of it. That's what John advocates. It's like, let go, be different. Let's embrace different. Let's embrace challenges. Let's embrace change. And I pulled some of these quotes, and I was just like, whoa. Going all the way back to September. People are like, look, we're telling you over and over again, we're done. We're burnt out. The pressure has become too much for adults. So how are we thinking about adult care and shifting the amount of pressure and what we're requiring? It's going to become important if school's going to maintain this why. Otherwise, we're going to lose the why of education, right? There was a study done, and I'm going to show you some more results from the study, and it actually asked teachers who cares about them. And teachers actually said, 70% said, look, my school building team, they care about me. I believe my school building team cares about me. Only 30% believe that their district cared about them. And that's an even less number. It said they said the community, only 15% believe the community valued them. And then when they thought about elected officials, you might as well say nobody felt valued. And this is what the survey of teachers said. So how are we helping them feel like they're valued recognizing we're starting at a deficit. So what are we putting in to make sure that they even feel cared about? So this is the study that was done, and it even talks about, from University of Chicago, how many people are encouraging their kids and their younger. I have a niece that's graduating. I'm not telling her to be a teacher. I'm not telling her to go in the field of education. And it's really like, how many people are actually telling people not to be teachers? It's huge. It's growing. What does that mean for the purpose of education? Are we going to be able to maintain our why for education? The other thing is, they did a study on like, what are the barriers, right? If people aren't going into education and people are telling people why they're not going into education, what are the barriers? It's so interesting to see that, yeah, we can put pay there, but what's the other thing is, schools don't meet the needs of students. That's the second largest barrier for why people aren't going into education. It doesn't believe we're attuned to that hierarchy of school needs, of students' needs, right? Then they say the workload, and then they're like stress. And it's interesting to see that the stress dealing with students and the stress of dealing with parents is about the same. And so how are we being attuned and dealing with that, right? Another thing I took from Ed Weekly is teacher says, stop telling us to take care of ourselves. Leader says, stop. In the article, it says, stop. And they say, while well-intentioned, it feels very patronizing. They say, instead of advocating and pushing self-care, they're like, look, can you just be honest and say, my life and existence is hard right now? And can we talk about ways that you can support me through the hardness instead of minimizing it, right? And making it about just me and things that I need to do. Can we acknowledge that the system has to do something too? The other thing that we're hearing, and it's a quote I took from the article, is, look, I feel like wellness is being weaponized. And they said, look, you're putting pressure on people to better themselves, and you don't talk about the things around them that they can't control. So in turn, it's a lot of self-blame, a lot of self-criticism, a lot of I am not good enough instead of I am doing the best I can. And so how do we not weaponize wellness in these moments also, right? And this is, how do we acknowledge that, let's not just embrace a self-betterment movement, right? Because it talks about, it puts the onus of control only on the individual, and it makes it almost competitive, and it makes people almost insecure. And so how do we not do that when we're advocating for care and wellness? So in your groups, I'm going to stop screen sharing. Amanda's going to put you in groups now. I want you all to think about, I've laid out what the field is right now. What do you all think are the top two, and I want you all to be prepared to share it out. What are the top two reasons you feel like burnout is pervasive right now in education? And what are the top two reasons people are sticking with education? And we're gonna have your group share it out. I wanna know, what are the top two reasons you think people are burned out, and the top two reasons people are still showing up? Y'all are still showing up. Why are y'all still showing up? I wanna know. So Amanda will open the groups, and we'll have you all go back, and we'll go from there. And where does something else begin, right? Boundaries actually are a place where we can actually say, look, here's where my expectations, where you personally, I recognize that there are other identities that you have to have, and where your professional identity ends. If you don't have clear boundaries, everything meshes together. And so when you don't see clear boundaries, the questions you have to ask is, what is my personal integrity with myself? And then the system has to ask itself, What is our system integrity? Do we really understand that people come in and they leave? Or are we just embracing them to come in and not giving it to? You all heard me say trauma-informed healing center. John says it all the time. You have to be committed to assessing and reflecting. And that assessing and reflecting can even be personal. You know, some questions I've shared before is, are we asking ourselves, where should I have uttered a no today and I didn't? What core belief kept me from uttering that no? And am I willing to change that core belief? Why or why not? Another set of questions, what does my body need right now? What is your body telling you I need right now? And then ask yourself, why am I not willing? If my body's saying it needs rest, why won't I give it rest? Have I bought into meritocracy that as long as I'm moving, I'm good? Have I decided I don't have good boundaries? Why won't I give my body what it needs? The other thing is connection and creativity. Are we just having meetings and meetings and expecting everybody to listen? Are we having opportunities for authentic connection, for visioning, for creativity? If you want to usher in hope, do something creative. Listen to some music. Creativity ushers in hope because I have to have a positive idea about what I'm feeling. And the other thing we all said, we all need more regulation strategies. How are we sharing them? And even how are we offering moments to do them? That becomes important. And so one of the things that you all have seen over the course of this series is a conversation about, you know what? How do we think about mental health? How do we think about SEL? How do we think about academics? You all have PBIS, RTI. Everything thinks about how do we think about it in terms of multi-tier systems of support. So how are we thinking about it from core? What do we need to have? Everything that's low frequency and low dosage. And then how are we thinking about core plus more, which is a little more intensity, a little more frequent? And then how are we thinking about core plus more plus more? You all just said that everything has to be based on adult care. So one of the things I'm wondering is, what would it be like to think about adult care on this same MTS continuum? What core supports are we giving our adults? What's our core plus more? What's our core plus more for adults? And that becomes important. And so when you're thinking about, you know, and how are we extinguishing the difference, right? Of core and core plus more. And so one of the things, and I'm going to stop sharing for a minute, that becomes important, because I want to give you all an opportunity to have a little bit of a break, is when we think about core supports for teachers, we really have to think about how are we thinking about system level things to do differently. One of the things, I have a principal who recognized some of his teachers were overwhelmed. He said they were doing too much. So he does his thing, and for 30 minutes, he does it every day for 2 hours. For 30 minutes, he goes and he rotates into a teacher's room so that that teacher can take a break and do whatever they need, because he says their schedules were overwhelmed. That's one way. He's like, look, I don't know how to do this. Is the best way I can think of. But he's really like, this is how I'm providing core support, right? Are there opportunities where we really think about how can we offer? I tell anyone, core supports to think about how am I offering rest, not how am I offering spaces to do more. If we're gonna provide core supports for adults, we have to think about how are we intentional about offering opportunities for rest? How are we intentional about offering opportunities for nervous systems to calm down? And not saying I'm gonna give you a yoga class after work, which means you gotta figure out other pieces, but how am I doing it and being intentional about opportunities for rest and nervous system release within the time frame allotted for your day? Right. And so holding that, how am I offering opportunities for reflection? And so now I'm gonna throw it to John, because he has some ideas about this adult care piece, I know, because he's been sitting with it for a lot and he tries to lead it. So I'm going to throw it to John to share some other thoughts about this continuum of adult care, and then we'll take some questions. John.
Thanks, Courtney. Let me just pull up the slide. And actually, like, I want to kind of go back here real quick, if that's cool. Right here. When I think of this continuum of adult care, it makes me think, I've heard a lot of people, and like, I'm looking for a little bit of feedback here. Have we heard maybe that a lot of the staff wellness focused stuff is about like, hey, take care of yourself? And I've recognized that like some people just simply want to retch when they hear that. Is that fair? Am I okay? So, I had a conversation. I've talked to Courtney a bunch about this. I've also had a conversation recently with another colleague where the degree to which we like kind of focus our attention to staff needs to be really about what they actually need and not what we perceive that they need. And, the way it was described to me was like, sometimes we perceive that staff like need stuff, they need resources or they need information. And for a staff member that's like, no, I have all the stuff I need, I just don't believe it's possible to do this. They need a different frame of reference. They need a different approach. For the staff member that doesn't actually have the stuff they need, but they believe that it can happen, well, you got to give them stuff, right? You got to resource them. You got to make sure that they're well provisioned. So I often see that it's unfortunately like a single strategy approach to all staff's needs. And that doesn't lend itself well to good outcomes, because the person that has what they need but doesn't believe in the outcome that they are pursuing, they need a different kind of support. The staff that doesn't have what they need but believes in the outcome and is scared about the fact that it's going to fail because they don't have the resources, they just need a different approach. So with this whole continuum, I think it's really nuanced in a way. It can't just be the case that we're just going to make sure everyone has what they need and we're not going to attend to the ways in which they are perceiving the outcome. That's just not going to go well for all staff. So this nuanced approach is necessary. I do think that there are some things that you can do universally for staff, as long as it is kind of like good because it's good, right? Like, as long as it's not tapping into this idea where, how about this one? Like, we're gonna run a yoga class after school, and for the staff member that's like, I am completely and totally burned out. The last thing I need to do is to like work out after school. I just want to go home. I actually need rest. I actually need to eat. I haven't eaten all day, and you want me to do exercise after school? That's not going to help me. So tailoring these, I almost want to call them like kind of pocketed universal supports, like universal supports that are going to be good for a broad group of individuals, that are universally accessible, but that people can kind of opt into, select into. That to me feels like a better approach. When I think about tier 2 and tier 3 approaches for our community, I think it really does. We need to keep those slices of like kind of opt-in opportunities that are going to nest within the specific needs of groups. But they're slightly more intense. And that's the hallmark of our MTSS. Intensity increases as we move up the tiers of support. So maybe we're now talking about like, well, this is an opportunity for us to have a group-based conversation or processing meeting around a specific event or specific need. And at tier 3, yeah, do we have an employee assistance program? I don't know, maybe. And if we don't, then how could we build that out? So I think there are a lot of different things that we can kind of imagine across these tiers of support. But the big thing for me, and what really resonated with me in my recent conversations with people, is like, you have to tailor those specific supports to the actual why, in terms of what someone needs. If they don't need resources and they just need perspective, you need to give them perspective. If they don't need perspective and they just need resources, then you need to give them resources. It has to actually match with their needs, or it's just going to fall flat. Okay. I'm wondering about kind of this, Courtney, talk to me about this, the guidepost for a wholehearted living.
Yeah, so it's a little bit about Brene Brown. Brene Brown, she talks and a lot of us listen. you know, and she talks about vulnerability. But one of the things with Brene Brown is she says, look, we can't cultivate anything unless we let go of something. And so it's an acknowledgement that we have a lot that we're holding on to that we need to let go of. And so one of the things is the challenge is how do we think about that in the context of what John is trying to say? We got a lot of stuff, but we got to let go of some. We got to cultivate something new, but that means we're going to have to let go of other things. And so Brene Brown has this thing like, look, to cultivate meaningful work, you got to let go of self-doubt and supposed to. Right? She said to cultivate self-compassion, we got to let go of expecting people to show up perfectly, let go of perfection. She says, if we're going to cultivate gratitude and joy, we got to let go of being driven by fear and scarcity and darkness. You got to let it go. We got to believe that everything's going to mature to where it's supposed to be in its time. You all heard me say the thing like, look, cultivate creativity. We got to cultivate creativity. We got to do more creative things. You're never going to be creative if you're constantly comparing your environment, comparing individuals. You got to let go. And the last thing I'm gonna say, she says, if we want to encourage play and rest, you all heard John and I both said something had core. If you're doing courses, it has to be rest. Then you're gonna have to let go of exhaustion. You're gonna have to let go of expectations of productivity. You're gonna have to let go of rewarding of going above and beyond. One of the things I heard someone say, she's like, I go above and beyond because I don't know any other way to show up in the world, but I'm exhausted. And so, how are we helping people not show up and push themselves to exhaustion, but to push themselves to help? And so, this is just a reminder that in order to cultivate, there's some mindsets and ways of beings that we have to let go of. And that's the only way we're going to, in order to cultivate trauma informed and healing centered, we got to begin to let go of our trauma inducing ways. We got to let go of our rigidness. We got to let go of our one way of defining success. We got to let go of the idea that in order to solve a problem means we throw more stuff at it and people do more. No, to solve a problem, and I want you to creatively solve it, I got to give your brain a moment and your body a moment. We got to do less. Otherwise, the creativity won't come. So that's a little bit about why that's there. Yeah.
Courtney, there was this awesome article recently, and it was in the land of Zoom. I think sometimes it's like we're scheduling these meetings back to back to back to back because I don't have to move, right? I'm just toggling to another Zoom meeting, and there was this, like I said, this article was showing these fMRI scans of people who took a 10 or 15-minute break in between meetings, and those who just kind of trucked on through the entire day with meetings, and the chaos that was represented in that fMRI scan for those individuals that didn't take a break was really, really telling. Just an inability to attend, an inability to concentrate, an inability to really engage in critical thinking, or to empathize, or to relate. We talk a lot about the neurosequential model, right? We are throwing the neurosequential model into complete and total disarray. We are brainstem for sure if we are not attending to our brain's need for a break. So I thought that was so interesting as you're talking about kind of letting stuff go and cutting stuff out. The idea that you can have 38 meetings in a day with no break. It's not real, folks. You can't do it unless you want subpar performance. So we just got to take care of each other. Courtney, and this is it. This is it.
We're
brought us
done.
home. 6 sessions over the course of a year. We're rolling up on the end of the year. I'm super psyched that you were here today and that you get to hear Courtney's brilliance. She is truly wonderful. Psyched that Amanda's here, helping us out, organizing everything behind the scenes, just completely and totally just priceless and wonderful. Friends, I think this is, we're going to be signing off.